Thunder students, Mr. Williams back. Another subsection here of Section 13, Reagan and the American Resurgence. We are sliding into the 1990s. 1988 election. America, for the most part, is still happy with the policy and the progress that our nation has seen emotionally, mentally, societally, and most notably financially through the 1980s. Many people see Republican candidate for the presidency, George Herbert Walker Bush, as a continuation of the Reagan administration. He was the VP for Reagan from 81 through 89. So when he's running in 88, many people think, hey, the economy's strong, things are good, let's go ahead and keep similar policies in the executive office. He defeats the gentleman seated here or standing here to the right, Michael Dukakis, governor at the time of Massachusetts. Herbert Walker attacks Dukakis as being a East Coast elitist, extremely liberal Democrat. He's going to tax you. He's going to regulate the economy more. He's basically going to cause all the progress that we've experienced to dissipate. Okay, and he's not going to be a hardliner on the war on drugs, and he's not going to be a hardliner with foreign adversaries. Dukakis can't deflect the attacks and ultimately just gets stomped at the polls, 53 to 46 in terms of the popular vote percentage. And again, in presidential politics, that's a solid win, Electoral college, enormous as well, 526 to 11. Should read 526 to 11, not 426. I think they got that off. Or maybe it was 426 to 111. Anyways, data there is not 100% correct. Need to get that fixed. But Herbert Walker Bush is going to take over, and immediately upon his watch, Ronald Reagan is seen as the president that leads to the defeat of the Cold War, but it actually defeated the Soviets to win the Cold War, but it actually does not take place until his predecessor, all right? Not predecessor, geez. Been too many screencasts, too short a time. His successor, all right, the person that follows him, George Herbert Walker Bush, HW, takes over as president. From 89 to 91, we see several Soviet satellite states earn their independence. We see the falling of the Berlin Wall, and then eventually the complete dissolving of the Soviet Union. We're going to have the new Russian Federation. Ukraine is going to be its own nation. Poland gets its independence back. Czechoslovakia gets its independence back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's still some civil unrest in some of these new nations, and that's going to roll over through the 1990s, and Bill Clinton's going to have to deal with some of that. But ultimately, the Soviet Union's government becomes too weak. Militarily speaking, it's no longer doable to suppress some of these revolutions, and a lot of these nations earn their independence and then eventually completely are given it outright through the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Again, a couple of major items here that cause the Cold War to come to a close. And I'm trying to remember what this video depicts. I think it kind of talks about the fall of the Berlin Wall and ultimately
on the 25th of December, 1991, the world watched as the most powerful communist country in history collapsed. Following the resignation of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, dissolved into 15 independent states, marking the Federation's downfall and ending the Cold War, which had lasted 44 years between the East and the West. The reasons for the collapse are subject to much debate. However, many place blame on the eighth and final leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. In 1985, Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party. For many, this was a relief and sign of hope, as he promised a program of reform and fundamental change.
And it goes on to talk about glasnost, perestroika, the collapse of the economy, civil unrest, etc. And ta-da, we've got the fall of the Soviet Union, the conclusion of the Cold War. Look up that video. Again, there's several of them online if you want to check it out further. Now, George H.W. Bush also has to deal with some foreign adversaries, not of Soviet descent or Soviet association. The Persian Gulf War from 1990 to 1991. Ultimately, what happens is megalomaniac, authoritative ruler of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, wants to expand his foothold in the Middle East. He wants more access to oil. Saddam liked money. Saddam liked control. His invasion of Kuwait, just to the southern tip of Iraq, jeopardizes and threatens Saudi Arabia, a longtime ally of the United States of America. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, okay? So not a free nation like the United States of America, but still, we get along with the Saudis because they've always protected American interests in the Middle East. It goes back to the days of us constituting Israel through the United Nations after WW2, and then all of those colonial empires exiting the Middle East and turning control over to the indigenous individuals. Just a mess. The Middle East was a mess prior to, has been a mess since. The stability, though, in the region is rocked when Saddam Hussein aggressively invades and takes over the oil fields in Kuwait, okay? Takes over that nation. Not cool, right? So many of the nations in the Middle East go, oh, we're not sure where he's going to stop and when he's going to stop. So an allied coalition is put together. Basically, Herbert Walker goes and talks to other nations around the world and says, hey, unrest and destability in the Middle East is not good. We need to put Saddam in check. So let's drive him out of Kuwait. This is the Persian Gulf War. Operation Desert Shield is immediately commenced. That is a buildup of allied coalition forces in Saudi Arabia. So basically, Kuwait, it's a quick jump across the Persian Gulf into Saudi Arabia. We're making sure, okay, that Saudi Arabia is not invaded. All right, so a buildup of troops to deter an Iraqi forces invasion of Saudi Arabia. There are several then overtures made by HW and coalition forces to Saddam, basically like, hey, get out of Kuwait. All right, get out of Kuwait. No, I'm not going to. Okay, well, we got all these people over here, so you can't come here. I don't think I'm going to take Saudi Arabia. Okay, but you need to get out of Kuwait. No, I don't think so. Okay, here's the date you have to get out of Kuwait by, or else. All right, so whatever, or else. Go ahead, show me. That's Operation Desert Storm. It kicks off with aerial bombardment of missiles, which basically knocks out the vast majority of strongholds that the Iraqis had established in Kuwait. And then within 72 hours, a land invasion that just decimates the Iraqi army and sends them sprinting back inside the borders of Iraq. 300 Allied casualties. 300 Allied casualties compared to 30,000 KIAs for the Iraqi army. Bush is seen as a liberating hero. His approval rating skyrockets into the upper 80s, low 90s. That is insane. That's higher than Reagan at any point in time. So in 1991, all right, 1991, you got to think we are a year out from the election in 92. So just 12 short months away from Bush's re-election campaign. He is seen as a liberating hero. The economy is doing okay. There are some signs of weakness there. Bush has reneged on a few promises that he made back in the 1988 election. So there are some question marks in his re-election or re-electing ability. But man, everybody's approving for the most part of what he's doing. So it seems like it's a slam dunk. All right. But Americans do have short memories. So this enormous foreign policy success, which is seen as a sign of strength for America and the West again, while the Soviet Union has come toppling down, it's going to be quickly forgotten by the American public as we enter into the 1992 election. But a couple of videos here. Is this our 62nd president over Herbert Walker? Yes, it is. Well, check this out, followed by a recap of the Persian Gulf War.
When George Bush was elected president in 1988, some people thought of it as a third term for Ronald Reagan. Bush was Reagan's vice president, and he more or less promised to keep Reagan's policies going. Voters put Democrats in control of Congress, but sent a Republican to the White House. Bush had some remarkable success at foreign policy. He had been an ambassador to the United Nations in China, and the head of the CIA. The world needed his expertise. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Bush had a steady hand and helped usher in the post-Cold War world. After Iraq invaded Kuwait, Bush assembled a huge international coalition to drive Iraq out. Bush had less luck at home. Thanks to the huge debts of the Reagan years, big changes to domestic programs were unaffordable. Bush famously made a campaign promise of no new taxes, but when the economy started to sour, he broke that promise and signed a tax increase, which was his ultimate downfall as president. He tried to promote volunteerism, and he signed the law banning discrimination against the disabled, but he didn't have Reagan's flair inspiring people. With the
economy in a slump, voters denied him a second term.
All right. Wrap that up. And we got a little recap here of the Persian Gulf War. Solid, quick little recap.
Over the past century, the United States has gotten involved in its fair share of Middle Eastern affairs. In 1991, America again found itself in the middle of an armed clash, this time between Saddam Hussein's Iraq and its neighbor Kuwait, in what would become known as the Persian Gulf War. Here are 5 points you should know to better understand this conflict. Few people would have called Saddam Hussein a stable leader. From the start of his reign in 1979, he ruled with an iron and often reckless fist. In 1990, Saddam sought to acquire Kuwait's vast oil reserves. Publicly, he justified the invasion by claiming that Kuwait belonged to Iraq in the first place and had been unfairly carved out as a separate country by the League of Nations. However, Kuwait actually became independent before Iraq's sovereignty, making his thinly veiled argument ridiculous. Either way, Saddam seized Kuwait on August 8, 1990, causing an international uproar, with the United States being the loudest voice.
The United States strongly condemns the Iraqi military invasion of Kuwait.
Soon after the invasion, the United Nations Security Council declared that if Saddam's forces did not withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991, military force would be used. You can guess what happened. On January 16th, the offensive against the Iraqi army began, fought by a broad coalition of armed forces from the United States, United Kingdom, France, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, among many others.
P.S. I was wrong in my Middle Eastern geography. Every now and then I get to Iraq and Iran flipped. Saudi Arabia borders just to the south west of Iraq. Kuwait's right at the southern tip of Iraq, right to the very northeast of Saudi Arabia. So the same peninsula action there.
The first stage of the Gulf War was named Operation Desert Shield, which actually began before the international coalition was brought together. When Saddam first invaded Kuwait, the United States rushed troops into Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, to prevent a possible attack. But after the Security Council's declaration of war, it became the American force that would invade Kuwait. The main phase of the war was codenamed Operation Desert Storm, which began on the morning of January 17, 1991. Desert Storm was a massive bombing campaign targeting Iraqi aircraft, anti-air defenses, oil refineries, communication lines, weapon factories, bridges, and roads using the latest American military technology, including stealth bombers, cruise missiles, and smart bombs. After a month of Desert Storm, the coalition aimed to finish the job. The coalition's ground offensive, known as Operation Desert Saber, began on February 24th, 1991. By February 28th, the war was over.
And as president, I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
In 4 days, the U.S.-led forces retook Kuwait's capital and forced the entire Iraqi army into retreat. In all, Iraq lost somewhere around 30,000 soldiers, while America and its allies only lost 292 total. The Persian Gulf War was an easy and lopsided victory for the United States, but not one without serious consequences. President George H.W. Bush decided not to depose Saddam Hussein, as he didn't believe regime change would be popular with America's allies. In the wake of the war, Kurdish and Shiite Iraqis rose up against Saddam, who in turn brutally crushed their rebellions. After the UN accused him of using chemical weapons against his own civilians,
Shiites, Sunnis, Kurdish, we're all talking different ethnic groups of the Middle East / the world of Islam. Okay, again, lots of complexities in the Middle East, but nevertheless, there are some nations that are more forgiving or recognizing of one interpretation, ethnic interpretation of the Quran compared to the other, one ethnic minority of Middle Eastern descent compared to the other. Again, lots of explanation for that, but the Kurdish people are still an ethnic group in the Middle East that doesn't really have a nation to call home, or a nation that necessarily will legitimately and securely house them or offer them, independence of some sort.
Saddam was forced.
Oh no!
Over the
Sorry. Dang it. Anyways, good little recap there of the Persian Gulf War. We are about to the end of that, and this does it with our intro subsection to the 1990s. We'll pick it up with our last subsection from section 13, the election of 1992. Adios.